I was in a school trip some time ago, and we were in this like museum slash house of some deceased royalty or rich person or whatever, and the house in question was just decked, just absolutely like every nook and cranny was full of some art or ornament or detail, right? But I'm not just talking about the paintings or the ceramics and whatnot. I'm talking like the skirting board was full of detail, and the chairs, and the little like resting spot for their umbrellas were detailed, right? It's so ornate, every little detail. And I wondered, like, the Industrial Revolution has significantly lowered the cost of making such items, right? Because back in the day, if you wanted like a super ornate chair, you'd have to, get someone, hire them to carve out by hand some wooden chair and like brass and whatnot. And now we can just mold them and, right? So if we have the capacity for so much more detail, then why don't we do so? Well, actually, there was a small period in time where the amount of detail was increasing for the lower classes, which was, well, the very beginnings of the 1900s, where automation was enough of a thing, where the price of goods were actually decreasing and there was anti-inflation. That's right. For a while, you had the reverse of inflation, where money became more valuable. Something that my generation has never seen, but it's true. And back then, normal people suddenly could afford fancy furniture, just like their richer counterparts, and it was cool. Um, but then something shifted, and we became less and less interested in detail and interior design and furnitures and just infrastructure in general. You look at street lamps from way back when, and they're so much more ornate and they're like piece of art. And now you just have a rectangle on a stick with an LED light on it, and that's about it. Partially, it's because cutting costs, but it's not just that. There's another explanation, which is that technology has taken more and more of our attention spans. We had the newspaper, then the radio, and then the TV, and now internet and computers. So we're spending more and more of our brain power up here, consuming content and not actually looking around our environment. And your brain has a fixed amount of brain juices to spend every day. A certain amount of brain power it can allocate per day. So when it spends a certain amount reading the newspaper, radio, or TV, it can spare less and less for other things. I mean, some cultures obviously still prefer to do maximalist layouts and aesthetics, but I'm not talking about that. What you'll see is, for example, back when we had newspapers, we still had very detailed environments. Then we got radio, and the general environment around us, we spent more and more time listening to the radio, so less detail to occupy our brains. And then we got TV, and suddenly, just like right now, people start watching TV for hours on end. And when you're spending that many hours in front of a screen, just getting constant stimulation, you don't want your environment to also be a burden up here, right? You don't want just looking around your room or the outside to be that mentally stimulating. And now we've reached really pushing the limits of minimalism here in the 21st century with the advent of social media, where we're spending a dangerous amount of hours. In fact, Google put out a press release saying that I believe on average people watched 200 billion YouTube shorts per, I think it was day, week, or month, one of the two. Either way you slice it, it's a lot of man hours we're spending on social media, for good and worse, usually for worse, almost always. But that's different. That's for a different day. So that's my thesis. The idea that we only have a certain amount of brain power, and more of it that we spend looking at content and consuming and stimulating digitally, the less we can spare for the outside world around us. And I think this is probably true. And I think you'll agree with me here. The other thing is typography. If you've noticed, there was a peak sort of typography detail era also in the early 20th century where you had these super ornate fonts because suddenly printing presses and the ink and all these industrial printers became so much more accessible for normal companies where you could have this super ornate and eye-catching design for your product labels. But now when you know notoriously the past 10, 15 years we've actually seen logos decrease in detail because the fact of the matter is we spend less and less time actually observing the outside world. So the objective for companies isn't to catch your eye with detail and bedazzling, it's more catching your eye and hopefully staying your brain long enough in those 0.01 seconds to be remembered. Um, and you also see this in computer UIs too. I know I already made a video about OSs this week, but let me explain. Um, the I when computers first rolled out with graphical interfaces, the icons and the graphics on the screen were very skeuomorphic. Skeuomorphic meaning that it was close to the real world. So if you had a drawing or writing app, you would have a pen on the screen, or you would have some books and whatnot for the reading apps to make it similar to the real world, to lower the learning curve, to flatten it, to make it more approachable and accessible. And there was a peak era of detail for icons in the late 90s and early 2000s where the graphical chips in the computers were powerful enough to have 3D icons and all these cool renders, but people hadn't yet leaned too much into social media. When we started using social media, well, suddenly it wasn't even the computer itself using our brain power, it was the content inside the computer. So suddenly our UIs became more and more minimalist, less and less detail, flat colors, close to zero, honestly, shading or texturing. Everything became flat in general, and that was for a really clear reason. If you're a social media company like Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or TikTok, you want the user's attention to be on the content, right? You don't want them spending time looking at the nav bar or the stuff around the content. You want them fixed on the content for ad revenue. So you use high contrast and black and white buttons and very super minimalist, low detail light, little pictures and whatnot on the buttons. I don't want to ramble too much, but I think you get the idea. And typography now, if you notice, it's all sans serif. In UI, it's just like branding. Very few companies actually use serif fonts because, well, they have more detail and they're just a slight bit more difficult for some people to read, and that's enough for almost all companies to ditch it. Honestly, I'm surprised that AI companies like Anthropic have actually used serif fonts. It's a differentiator, so maybe that's a play. But yeah, I think the more we stimulate ourselves with data and content and media, the less detailed we want our surrounding environment to be because we get our stimulation from elsewhere. And we could argue about the effects of social media, but I feel like most people would agree that stimulating yourself with the art around you in the physical world is probably healthier than stimulating yourself with social media and brain rot and doom scrolling and whatnot. So this was a shorter one. Thank you for watching. Please comment down below if you have any thoughts or whatever you want actually. Well, and I'll see you later.